She almost didn't open it. The envelope had been sitting on her desk for 3 days, tucked under a stack of architectural drawings, half buried beneath her coffee thermos and a folder of revised purpose applications. Odalys had told herself it was junk mail. She had told herself it was a bill she already knew about. She had told herself a lot of things that week, because telling herself things was easier than reading what was actually written on that small piece of paper inside. But on the 4th morning, she picked it up, and everything changed. You need to understand something about Odalys Boateng before we go any further. She was not the kind of woman people noticed when she walked into a room. Not because she wasn't beautiful. She was, in the quiet way that only shows itself when someone is actually paying attention, but because she moved through the world like someone who had learned, very early, that being noticed cost you something. She kept her head down. She did her work. She stayed late when everyone else had already gone home, and she arrived early when the parking lot was still empty and the coffee hadn't been made yet. She was 31 years old. She had come to Toronto from Accra when she was 9, in the back seat of a taxi with her mother and 2 garbage bags full of everything they owned. Her mother, Amma, had worked cleaning offices for 11 years before her knees gave out. Odalys had put herself through school on bursaries and weekend shifts at a grocery store on Eglinton. She had a degree in civil engineering from Ryerson. The University of Toronto had waitlisted her, and she had taken it as the universe telling her something she didn't need to hear twice. She worked at Crestline Infrastructure Group, a mid-sized firm in the downtown core that specialized in bridge retrofits and public transit projects. She had been there for 4 years. She was the only black woman on the structural team. She was also, quietly, the most detail-oriented person in the building, though no one had ever said that out loud, at least not to her face. Her name wasn't on any of the big proposals. It was never on anything that mattered. The project that was about to either make or end her career was called the Bellwood Overpass Renewal. It was a $340 million contract with the City of Toronto, the largest infrastructure bid Crestline had ever pursued. The lead engineer was a man named Foster Renwick, silver-haired, well-connected, the kind of man who had the mayor's cell number saved under a first name. There were 12 engineers on the proposal team. Odalys was the most junior. Her job was to check calculations, verify load specifications, and format the submission documents. She was not invited to the client meetings. She was not consulted on the design philosophy. She was handed a stack of binders and told to make sure the numbers lined up. And she did. For 6 months, she made sure the numbers lined up. The submission deadline was a Friday in November. The city would announce the winning bidder in February. In the weeks leading up to submission, the office had the particular energy of a place where people were sleeping too little and eating too badly and pretending everything was fine. Foster moved through the floor like a man who expected the walls to part for him. The junior staff avoided eye contact in the hallways. Someone had put a whiteboard in the kitchen with a countdown. Odalys worked until 10 o'clock most nights. She took the subway home, stood because there were no seats, ate whatever was in her fridge, and slept for 5 hours. She did not complain. Complaining, in her experience, was a luxury available to people who could afford the social capital it cost. The building's night cleaning crew came through at 7:30 every evening. Odalys had gotten used to the sound of them, the hum of the vacuum in the hallway, the clatter of the recycling bins, the specific squeak of wheels on the floor near the kitchen. She had learned not to hear it. It was background, the way rain is background, the way traffic is background. She had never spoken to the man who cleaned her floor. His name was Otta. He was 54 years old, and he had been cleaning that floor for 6 years, 5 nights a week, from 7:30 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Before that, he had spent 20 years in Abuja, working as a structural engineer. He had designed footbridges. He had overseen highway overpasses. He had trained younger engineers, who now ran firms of their own. He had a framed degree on the wall of his apartment in Scarborough, and a wife named Grace, who taught French at a secondary school, and a daughter at McMaster studying medicine. His credentials were not recognized in Canada. He had applied for recognition 3 times with the Professional Engineers Ontario licensing body. 3 times, he had been told he needed to complete additional coursework, write additional exams, submit additional documentation. The process had already cost him $7,000 and 5 years. He was still waiting on the 4th review. So he cleaned offices. He cleaned them quietly and carefully and without complaint, because Otta was the kind of man who had decided a long time ago that bitterness was a poison you mixed for someone else but drank yourself. He cleaned the floors. He emptied the bins. He wiped down the whiteboards. And sometimes, just sometimes, he read the things written on the walls. He didn't mean to. It wasn't his business to look at the drawings pinned above Odalys's desk, or the calculations she'd taped to the window, or the open binders she always left in the same way when she went home, slightly fanned out, so she could find her place quickly in the morning. He wasn't looking for anything. He was just doing his job. But he was also an engineer. And engineers, even retired ones, even ones holding mops, cannot stop their eyes from moving over numbers, the way a musician cannot stop their ear from catching a wrong note in a busy room. He saw it on a Tuesday. He wasn't sure at first. He stopped pushing the vacuum and stood still for a long moment, looking at the binder she'd left open on her desk. The calculation on the page was a load distribution formula, the kind used to assess how weight disperses across a multi-span structure under variable traffic conditions. He had done this calculation himself hundreds of times in another life. The number was wrong, not obviously wrong, not wrong in a way that anyone glancing at it would catch, but wrong in a specific, structural way that Otta recognized because he had made the same mistake himself once, 26 years ago, on a project in the Niger Delta, and his supervisor had caught it and circled it in red ink and said, quietly, "The bridge doesn't know what your formula intended. It only knows what you built." The load factor for the secondary span had been calculated using the standard reference table. But the Bellwood overpass, from what Otta could read on the drawings above the desk, sat on clay-dominant soil with a frost penetration depth that changed the bearing capacity calculations significantly. The number on the page didn't account for it, and if that number made it into the final submission, and if Crestline won the contract, and if no one caught it before the construction phase. He stood there for a long time. He thought about whether it was his place to say something. He thought about what it would mean to say something. He thought about what it had always cost him to say something in every office, in every room, in every country where he had been the person that people looked through instead of at. He finished cleaning the floor. He emptied the bin by Odalys's desk. And before he left, he tore a small piece of paper from the notepad he kept in his vest pocket, the one he used to write his grocery list and his daughter's exam schedule and the things Grace asked him to remember. And he wrote 4 words on it. He slid it under the binder she had left open. He told himself she would probably throw it away. He went home and didn't sleep well. Odalys found the note on Wednesday morning. She almost didn't. She moved the binder to get to her coffee, and the paper fell to the floor, and she picked it up the way you pick up anything that falls, automatically, without really looking. She was about to drop it in the recycling bin when she registered that it was handwritten. She looked at it. Check frost depth, bearing capacity. 4 words. No name, no explanation. She stood there holding it for a moment. Then she set it on her desk, got her coffee, and sat down. Her first thought was that someone on the team had left it. Maybe Foster. Maybe one of the senior engineers doing a review pass. She looked around the office. Most people hadn't come in yet, and felt a vague unease that she couldn't quite locate. She picked up the note again. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. The letters were the small, precise print of someone who had been trained to write on technical documents where clarity was not optional. She opened her binder. She found the page, and she started doing what she always did when something didn't sit right with her. She went back to the original data. She pulled the geotechnical report that had been filed with the city 18 months ago. She cross-referenced the soil classification. She looked up the frost penetration index for that specific corridor in the Ontario Building Code, and then she ran the bearing capacity calculation, again from the beginning, from scratch, using the actual site conditions instead of the standard default table. It took her 2.5 hours. When she was done, she sat very still and looked at the number on her screen. The discrepancy was not catastrophic. It was not the kind of thing that would cause a bridge to fall down the day it opened. But under sustained load, over years, with freeze-thaw cycling in a Toronto winter, the secondary span would experience settlement rates that the current design hadn't accounted for. The structure would need remediation within 8 to 12 years, potentially sooner. The city would be looking at tens of millions in repairs on a project that wasn't supposed to need major intervention for 30 years. If this went into the final submission, Crestline would win on a flawed design. And when the flaws showed up, because they always showed up, the liability would follow the company's name back to every engineer who signed off on the numbers, including her. She closed her binder. She opened it again. She looked at the 4 words on the piece of paper. Then she got up and walked to Foster Renwick's office. What happened in that office? The precise exchange of words, who said what in which order, how Foster's expression moved through surprise, and then irritation, and then something harder to name. Odalys would replay it many times in the months that followed, not with bitterness, though she had the right to bitterness. Mostly with the specific, clarifying kind of exhaustion that comes from watching someone manage the distance between who they want to be and who they actually are in a high-pressure moment. She laid out what she'd found. She showed him the recalculation. She put the geotechnical report on his desk and pointed to the soil classification data. Foster looked at it for a long time. He asked her how she had caught it. She said she had gone back to the original data. He asked her if she was sure. She said yes. He asked her if she had told anyone else. She said no. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Leave this with me." She left it with him. The submission was revised over the following week. New calculations were done, the right ones, using the correct site conditions. 2 senior engineers were brought in to run a full review of every load formula in the document. The corrections were made quietly, in the kind of professional hush that organizations use when they are fixed something that should never have needed fixing. Odalys's name was not in the revision notes. She had not expected it to be. She went back to her desk. She formatted documents. She checked calculations. She stayed late. She took the subway home. On the night after the corrected submission went in, she sat on the edge of her bed in her apartment and looked at the piece of paper she had kept in her jacket pocket for 2 weeks. 4 words in careful, deliberate print. She thought about who might have written it. She ran through the short list of people who had access to this floor at night, and she kept arriving at the same answer. And the answer made her feel something she wasn't quite sure how to name. The following Monday, she stayed at her desk until 7:45. She didn't look up when she heard the wheels squeak in the hallway. She kept her eyes on her screen. She listened to the sounds move through the space, the kitchen, the conference room, the area by the printer, and she waited. When the sounds were close, she looked up. He was tall, and he moved carefully, the way people do when they have spent years navigating other people's spaces. He wore a gray uniform, and he had close-cropped salt and pepper hair. He was pushing a cart. He didn't look at her. She said, "Excuse me." He stopped, she said. "Was it you who left the note on my desk about the frost depth?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," she said. "How did you know?" He looked at her then, directly for the first time in the way that people look at each other when they've decided that a moment is worth the risk of being honest. He said, "Because I used to be an engineer in Nigeria. I designed bridges." She looked at him. He said, "My credentials are not recognized here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" "Atta," he said. "Odalys," she said. They stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light, in an office that was empty except for them, and something passed between them that neither of them said out loud, a kind of recognition that has no clean word in English, but that exists in every language. And that means, "I see you. I know what you are carrying. I have been carrying something like it too," she said. "Can I ask you something?" He said. "Yes. The note. Why didn't you just—" She stopped, started again. "You could have said nothing. You didn't have to." He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about most things. Then he said, "Because the bridge doesn't know what your formula intended. It only knows what you built." She didn't know those words had been given to him by someone else. She only knew that they were the truest thing she had heard in a very long time. Crestline Infrastructure Group won the Bellwood Overpass renewal contract in February. The announcement came on a Tuesday afternoon. Foster sent a firm-wide email. Someone bought a sheet cake. There was a small celebration in the kitchen, where people stood around in the fluorescent light and said things like, "We did it, an incredible result, and this is what the team is capable of." Odalys stood near the back and ate a piece of cake and smiled when people caught her eye. Her name was not in the email. 3 weeks later, she was called into a meeting with Foster and the firm's managing partner, a woman named Helena Crowther, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had the particular manner of someone who had spent decades learning how to tell difficult truths without sounding unkind. Helena told Odalys that the client review team had flagged the revised submission for particular praise, specifically the accuracy of the geotechnical integration and the load analysis documentation, which they said was among the most thorough they had seen on a submission of this scale. Helena asked Odalys if she had anything to do with that. Odalys said yes. Helena looked at Foster briefly. Foster looked at his hands. Helena said, "I'd like you on the project delivery team, as a structural analyst lead." Odalys said, "I'd like that." Helena said, "Is there anything else you need?" Odalys thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "There is one thing, but it's not about me." What she asked for was not a dramatic gesture. She didn't ask for justice in the way that the word is usually used, loudly, publicly, as a demand. She asked for a meeting. She asked for Helena Crowther to sit down with Atta. She said, "Here is a man who has applied 3 times to the PEO licensing body. Here is a man who found a structural error that 12 engineers with recognized credentials did not catch. Here is a man who has been cleaning these floors for 6 years and who designed bridges for 20. I am not asking you to fix the entire system. I am asking you to make one phone call." Helena Crowther made the phone call. It was not a magic phone call. Systems don't transform because one person makes one call. Oda still had to complete the remaining steps. He still had to write the exam. He still had to wait. But the firm agreed to compensate him for the exam fees. Helena wrote a formal letter of support for his licensing application, describing the specific nature of the contribution he had made. A structural engineer on the team agreed to serve as his professional mentor, and Foster Renwick, who was not a bad man, but who had spent a long career learning to look at what was useful and away from what was uncomfortable, sent a short email to Otta's personal address that said 3 sentences and cost him more than most things cost him that year. It was not everything, but it was not nothing either. Odalys told me about the note once, a long time after everything had settled. We were sitting in a coffee shop on a gray afternoon in March. The kind of afternoon Toronto does better than anywhere, where the light comes through the window at an angle that makes everything look like it's waiting for something. She held her cup with both hands, and she looked out the window for a moment before she spoke. She said, "I almost threw it away. I mean that. I had it over the recycling bin. I was already thinking about the report I had to finish. I asked her what made her stop. She thought about it. She said, I think I was tired. And when you're tired enough, you stop editing things before you look at them. You just look." I asked her what she thought now, when she thought about those 4 words. She smiled a little. She said, "I think about all the buildings I've walked into where someone invisible was holding something up, and I wonder how many of them I never said thank you to." She took a sip of her coffee. She looked out at the street. Then she said, "The bridge doesn't know what your formula intended." She said it quietly, like it was something she said to herself sometimes, in the particular voice we use for things we've decided to keep. Oda received his engineering license from Professional Engineers Ontario on a Thursday in September. He called Grace at her school. She had to step out of class to answer, and she cried in the hallway, and a student saw her and asked if she was all right, and she said, "Yes, my love. Yes, everything is perfectly fine." His daughter, who was in her final year at McMaster, drove home that weekend. They had dinner, jollof rice and fried plantain, and the chin-chin Grace made from scratch, and they sat around the table, and his daughter said, "Dad, I need a photo of you." He said, "What for?" She said, "Because I've been waiting my whole life to brag about you to people who don't already know." He laughed. He let her take the photo. He keeps it in his wallet now, not the framed degree on the wall, not the letterhead from Professional Engineers Ontario, but the photo his daughter took at the dinner table on that Thursday evening, with jollof rice cooling in the pot, and the kitchen light falling across everything in the way that light falls when it doesn't know it's being beautiful. He is no longer invisible. Maybe he never was. Maybe none of them are. Maybe the people we walk past without looking, the man who cleans the floor, the woman who works the overnight shift, the person holding the door at 7 in the morning. Maybe they are carrying things we would recognize if we ever remembered to look. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, welcome to Ancient African Folktales. We tell the stories that remind us who we are. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.